Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
A platform is as good as its algos. Let's say, for example, you have an algorithm writer on a particular platform who, for some reason, likes me. And an algorithm is created in which, if you Google my name, all the good parts about me come to the surface. And unless you really work very, very, very hard, you're not going to come across anything nasty about me unless you really do a very deep dive search. On the other hand, you have an algorithm writer who doesn't like me very much. Then all the nasty things, and believe me, there have been quite a few, they come to the surface and all the nice things are buried way, way down below. You understand? So from that point of view, this kind of an activity has been taking place, and so we find a widening of fault lines, a widening of people who, for no reason, start disliking on the basis of a completely wrong picture of the reality.
You just heard author and professor of geopolitics, Madhav Das Nalapat. In a world where more and more people burrow deeper into the silos of their way of thinking, the separation from an understanding of another view, much less an appreciation, is shrinking. In a healthy society, the moderate middle continues to grow at the expense of fringes, competing against each other in deepening the wells of hate and misunderstanding. As a consequence, the reality of all of us belonging to a common humanity gets lost. 3 decades ago, it was pointed out by Professor Nalapat that the cultural DNA of the people of India is a fusion of the Vedic, the Mughal, and the Western, something that was termed Indutva. No strand can stand alone, and yet not just within countries but between countries, there are outlier states that believe they and they alone have the right to assume primacy, even dominance, over the rest. In the 1930s in Europe, such a state, because it remained unchallenged throughout that decade, ignited a world war. The 21st century must not witness a similar Holocaust, and such an outcome is preventable only through the coming together of those committed to the equality of nations and to a free, open, and inclusive global commons that includes the entirety of the Indo-Pacific. In his book, Cold War 2.0, Professor Nalapat presents both the danger as well as the deterrent. What happened in the 1930s must not be repeated in the 2030s. The time for prevention is now.
Well, I just want to say that I spent 5 very happy years of my life in Bangalore from 89 to 94 on MG Road at the Times of India office. They were really wonderful times. There's a special something about this city. You heard about a melting pot. A melting pot seems to imply a kind of a similarity, a sameness. But what is lovely about Bangalore is that, you have a melting pot without any of the differences and divergences being removed, but all of them being, in a sense, celebrated. So it's a very unique kind of culture. And I would like to say I was privileged to be here. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here now in the Bangalore International Center. This is something that I absolutely could not pass up. Now, since I'm talking a little bit about autobiography, let me spend a minute and a half more and say there was a period in my life when it was difficult for me to write in what's called mainstream media. I'm not going to get into reasons for that, but it was difficult. And there were 2 publications that regularly carried my writings. One was called Radiance. It's the official magazine of the Jamaat-e-Islami. The other is called Organizer, which is the official publication of the RSS. So depending on which magazine you read, I was either an Islamic fanatic or I was a Hindu fanatic. I had to be one of either. Nobody except Islamic fanatics wrote for Radiance. Nobody except Hindu fanatics wrote for the Organizer. So luckily, after some point in time, the cross currents of domestic politics in India made it possible for me to once again get into the mainstream of reporting. And in case Radiance and Organizer have missed my writing, they haven't communicated that to me. Let me put it that way. You know, they've been very civilized about it, but they've not communicated that to me. Like, you view an elephant depends on which angle you look at. If you look at my writing, depending on the writing that you look at, depending on the angle in which you look at, I'll be different things to different people. There were two books that were written by me around the same period. One was called 75 Years of Indian Foreign Policy. That book was published by Rupa Publishers. And that book essentially was what I felt we could have done to take advantage of the opportunities that were available in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and right up to now, let's put it that way, when the book came out, which was last August. This book is essentially giving the context to that book. And this book is about what some of us for some time have been calling Cold War 2.0. Now, you have a large number of people who say, no, it can't be, because they confuse Cold War 2.0 with Cold War 1.0. It's completely different. It's like, for example, you have two children, and one child is completely different from the other. So if you look for one child in the other child, you don't find it. And then you say, how can they be brothers or sisters or whatever? But they are brothers and sisters. China is not the United States. The 21st century is not the 20th century. The Indo-Pacific is not the Atlantic. And the confrontation that's taking place now is taking place in a very different series of arenas than was the confrontation taking place in the time of the first Cold War. Now, why I'm talking about Cold War 2.0 is basically because Vikram here was talking about experts. And I was telling Vikram that, anytime you think somebody is an expert, you made a mistake, because it's very difficult to be an expert in something as rapidly changing, as rapidly different, and frankly, as complex, if I may say so, as been titled here, The Cross Currents of History. But the reality of the situation is that for quite some time, it has been evident that you have the Communist Party of China, the CCP, founded a little more than 100 years ago. From the beginning of that time, its charter was very clear. And its charter was that this is the philosophy, this is the ideology, this is the people. And essentially, it was based on a Han, the concept of the Han people. And the Han people concept is not an ethnic concept. It's not like saying white people or whatever. It's different. It's more of a cultural construct. So what happens is that you absorb a certain cultural mix, and then you're defined as Han. I know, for example, children of families where the husband or the wife is Indian and the spouse is Chinese, and they are brought up as Han Chinese in China. They're living in China, and they're accepted as Han Chinese. So it's not racism in the classic sense in which we define racism, but I would say it's more of a cultural synthesis, and it's pride in that synthesis, except that the Communist Party has evolved an entirely different kind of cultural synthesis from the classical Chinese synthesis. If you go to Taiwan, for example, you will see the tea ceremony in the old imperial Chinese form. You go to PRC, you're not going to see that happen. There's a huge difference in the culture of the PRC and classical Chinese culture, which is much bigger difference than you see in Taiwan, or, for example, Malaysian Chinese, or Singaporean Chinese, or Indonesian Chinese, or Thai, Chinese, and classical Chinese culture. So, again, as I said, the point was that even in the 1950s, late 1950s, if you study the polemics that were taking place by the 60s, let's say, between the PRC and the USSR, at that point in time, there was no certainty about who would win the first Cold War. There was a very real probability that the USSR and the USSR system would prevail. And from that point in time, you see the polemics between, say, the PRC, Mao, for example, and the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, and the kind of names that the Chinese Communist Party would call its Soviet counterpart. And you will understand this feeling that, look, you chaps are pretending to be the leaders, the vanguard, so to speak, of the communist movement. Sorry, we are the vanguard. We are the true communist movement. And you chaps are, low life. Let's put it that way. Now, Americans, the good or bad thing about America, they don't pick up hints. I think sometimes it's a good thing because a lot of hints I don't think one should pick up. It may not be good for blood pressure. But anyway, they took a while to pick up the hint that China, and that is the PRC. When I say China, I mean the PRC. But let me tell you very clearly, communist Chinese are different from non-communist Chinese. The top 20% of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is very different from the bottom 80% of that party. And the top 1% of that party is different from the rest of that party. And the top 1% of that 1% is very, very different from everybody else. And it's that 1% of 1% of 1% that runs the entire country. I must say that I've been to China dozens of times, sometimes alone, sometimes with my wife, Lakshmi. I've always gone there courtesy the Communist Party of China. Because if you go to China and you don't go there courtesy the Communist Party of China, you are a tourist. You can see the Ming vases, you can see the museums, you can see the roads, but you really have no access, in a sense, to what is the thinking and happenings that are going on in the governance heart of China, in the part of China that is really relevant in policy. And regrettably, some of us have been involved in policy for quite some time. So I've always gone there as, I wouldn't say a guest because, one pays one's own way in most part, but through the Communist Party. If you go to the United States, there's different. Let's say, for example, in the 1990s, when you had Bill Clinton as the president of the United States, he was, in my view, horribly anti-Indian. I'm sure that there must be quite a few admirers of Bill Clinton in Bangalore, as there are in other parts of the country. And certainly he got a rapturous reception when he finally came to India in the final weeks of his presidency. But the man was obsessed about two things. One was getting rid of our space capability, our nuclear capability, our missile capability, getting rid of it. Essentially giving the Chinese a monopoly in Asia of those capabilities. And secondly, he was very obsessed about the northernmost state of India and what should be done with the northernmost state of India. And Bill Clinton didn't really believe that India had, that our point of view and Bill Clinton's point of view is very different. And he put a lot of pressure on Narasimha Rao mainly. He was the prime minister at that point in time. And one good thing about Narasimha Rao, he will say no without saying anything. He will just look at you and stare at you and say, I see, I see. What he means by that I see is, well, I don't care what you're saying. I'm just not going to listen to you, but I'm too civilized a person. I come from Andhra Pradesh, and we are too civilized a people to say that we don't agree with you. But if you look into my eyes, you'll know what I mean. So he kept that at bay. But during those times, a chap like me, who frankly, these days, thanks to Google and whatever, you can see a lot of my writings, a lot of them. And you're welcome to comb through them and evolve for yourself what kind of, in Vikram's terms, expert or non-expert I am. If, let's say, the White House doesn't like you, it could very well be that the US Congress may love you. Maybe because the White House doesn't like you. If the Democrats don't like you, the Republicans may love you. In fact, during the 90s, I'm going to be neither politically correct or incorrect. I'm just going to be correct in my recollections. I was low life from India. Who the heck bothered about India in those days? What was India? Nothing. And you had some chap from India coming and trying to tell us what to do with our thing and what to do with our policy about India. We were low life. If you're low life, you're on the pavement and nobody wants to look at you. There were other forms of low life at that point in time in the US, and they were called, the neocons, the neoconservatives, the chaps around George Bush, those kind of guys who later on became hugely influential in the United States under Bush and Cheney. At that point in time, nobody listened to them. Nobody listened to me. So we formed a perfect match and we developed a lot of linkages with each other. And of course, I must confess, a lot of linkages with the other groups as well. But with the neocons, because both of us were at that point in time people nobody listened to in Clinton's Washington. Nobody likes not being listened to. So I've still got a little bit of a negative feeling about the Clintons. But the point is that during Bill Clinton's time, the relationship with China, there was no technology available to India. The entire store was open availability to China. At that point in time, someone was pointed out, watch out, these guys are not favoring your system. They're not going to suddenly get, because they got McDonald's and they got Kentucky Fried Chicken, it doesn't mean that the Communist Party is going to become even a Republican Party on steroids. Forget about a Democratic Party, a Republican or a neocon on steroids, which to some people is better and to other people is worse than a Republican on steroids. They're not going to become that. So frankly, some of us have been tracking the inevitable falling out of the interests of the United States and the PRC. But very importantly, that kind of thing became very visible in 2012 when Xi Jinping took over. Xi Jinping has got himself in the mold of what he wants to basically outshine Mao Zedong. Now, the difference between India and the United States, and this is something that was first said by a gentleman named Manmohan Singh, who was actually a very good prime minister and could have been a much better prime minister if he had been the party president also, but he was not. But anyway, he pointed out that when India got its freedom, over the few years before that, a large part of India separated during partition. Myanmar separated, Sri Lanka separated, different other parts of what was at one time run from British. The ASEAN countries of today, what we call the Middle East in classic textbooks, they had the Indian rupee. We basically inherited a shrunken country. When Mao Zedong took over in 1949 and set up the People's Republic of China, he doubled the land area of China. He took over Tibet, he took over Xinjiang, he took over Manchuria, he took over Inner Mongolia. He didn't bother about Taiwan, frankly, because he thought he could do it anytime later or whatever, or maybe he wasn't interested enough. But today what you're seeing, the South China Sea, for example, it's become almost a PLA lake. You have these islands here. And the problem now is when you have a situation, Mahatma Gandhi, there are some things he said and did that we may not, but some things were very, very prescient. And he said that this is a world where there's enough to meet every human being's need, but not to meet every human being's greed. So when you have a leadership that's very confident, that's expansionist, that basically believes it has a right to impose its ideology, and its ideology is based on its own superiority of its own system on the rest of the world has a problem. And today, we are seeing that in the South China Sea. You're seeing that in the steady erosion of the air and sea space of Taiwan, the attacks on the land space of Taiwan, the attacks on the land space of India, and very importantly, in cyberspace. I have a small research team, let's put it that way, that does some pretty good research. And they checked out, and all this is there on record because I've written about it. In the United States and India in particular, the internet space, internet chat rooms and internet fora have essentially, you have had a kind of an infiltration, a penetration by PRC elements to try and widen the fault lines in a society so that fringes become stronger and the moderate middle becomes weaker. Any society is healthy when the moderate middle expands and the fringes shrink. any fringe, when they start expanding, in the United States, it could be black and white. In India, it could be people of different faiths, different regions, different religions, different languages. Those who believe that in what exclusivism, those who believe in supremacy. Racial supremacy is bad, religious supremacy is bad. Essentially, if you look at the Sanatan Dharma doctrine, is that there are millions of paths towards the divinity, and each path is a good path. You're not going to stand in the way of that path. And that diversity is extremely important for a healthy society. Now, you have in the internet space, the problem is like you have a comfortable house, for example. Yesterday, I had a dinner at a very comfortable house. And since I keep my sources secret, I'm not going to name whose house I had dinner with. Very comfortable place. So like that, we are comfortable in our internet space. Let's say, for example, I don't like the United States. There are internet chat rooms and internet things which also everybody doesn't like the United States. And I love going there. And finally, I stopped going anywhere else. Let's say I love China. You have internet chat rooms that I love China. And more sinister, the fact is that these, through algorithms and through other means, they not only create feeling that this is a benign country, it also creates a feeling of distaste, distrust towards your own country. So you start feeling a loss of confidence in the future of your own country. And remember, we are a very young country. You look, for example, at West Asia. Just go west of India. Very, very young people. India, very young people. And if you start losing hope and you start losing confidence, then you start adopting radical points of view because you have nothing to lose. If you feel you have a very bright future ahead of you, you work hard, you study hard, you follow, a path until you believe you can reach. If you feel that goal is beyond reach, you don't do that. And very often you can run berserk. And very often you can be cannon fodder for people who have an affinity towards that kind of activity. So this is the point I'd like to say very, very clearly. And the point I'd like to say very clearly is that this kind of activity has been taking place through algorithms, for example, algorithm writers, etc., etc. Because a platform is as good as its algos. Let's say, for example, you have an algorithm writer on a particular platform who, for some reason, likes me. And an algorithm is created in which, if you Google my name, all the good parts about me come to the surface. And unless you really work very, very, very hard, you're not going to come across anything nasty about me unless you really do a very deep dive search. On the other hand, you have an algorithm writer who doesn't like me very much. Then all the nasty things, and believe me, there have been quite a few, they come to the surface and all the nice things are buried way, way down below. You understand? So from that point of view, this kind of an activity has been taking place. And so we find a widening of fault lines, a widening of people who, for no reason, start disliking on the basis of a completely wrong picture of the reality, which, again, I come back to my old theory of Indutva. And I'd like to say that, I'm happy I wrote that article in the early part of the 1990s in the Times of India. My point was very simple and very obvious point, that the DNA of every Indian is a compound of the Western, the Mughal, and the Vedic. There's a Westerner in all of us. There's a Vedic in all of us. There's a Mughal aspect in all of us. I remember back in the 90s, before Mr. Vajpayee came to power, talking with somebody who became very powerful when he did come to power. And he was arguing about, this kind of culture. And I pointed out that his daughter was wearing a salwar kameez. And I pointed out that the food on the table, I am a vegetarian, so I didn't eat a lot of the food on the table. The food on the table was, as far as I could tell, Mughlai food. So on the one hand, he's saying the Mughals are awful. On the other hand, his daughter is wearing a Mughal outfit and he's eating Mughlai food. So where's the logic here? So what I'm trying to say is that it's very important that we understand this essential strength. And I want to end by saying it's important we understand we have about 7,000 years of history. During certain periods of time, mainly the British period of time, we completely forgot about the whole of our history. Now, it's important for each of us as individuals to remember our childhood, to remember our adolescence, to remember our early adulthood, our middle age, and, I must confess that I've reached that stage. I'm not middle-aged, but I'm not going to tell you what I am because, I certainly am not going to, what do I say, make a confession of that sort. But it's important to remember all that. And each of these 7,000 years belongs to all of us. It's not that one part belongs to one section and one part belongs to one section and one part belongs to the other. It's a compound of all of us. And it's that compound that makes us strong as a people. It's that compound that makes this country and its people welcome in West Asia, welcome in ASEAN, welcome in the United States, welcome in Europe, welcome across the board. I simply want to say the Chinese took the maximum advantage from Cold War 1.2. They opportunistically sided with the United States against the USSR, which they hated. And they got a tremendous benefit out of it. Today, Chinese economy is 5 times our economy. At 1980s, we were roughly equal. When Mao was there and when we started independence, they were much less than half of what we were. Today, we have the same opportunity. If we make the right geopolitical choices in a fractured world, we have the same opportunity that the Chinese had in Cold War 1.2. And the biggest fear of the Chinese is that we will do that. The biggest fear is that industries that are relocating from China will migrate to India in large numbers. You have a regulatory framework, all these things have got to be changed. You've got to have a social ambience. All that is a work in progress. But let me say, I'm optimistic about a younger generation. I'm very optimistic, and not entirely because most of what I say, most of my internet rantings or whatever you call it, books, younger people seem to have a greater affinity to that. So obviously, I like people who like me. So, having said that, I'd like to point out this is our chance and our opportunity to take advantage of Cold War 2.0 for the younger generation. Make the correct geopolitical choices so that the next 25 years will truly be a golden age in terms of prosperity of the Indian people, and very importantly, an age in which we rediscover the reality of a common DNA. Thank you.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Center. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.